we build our products to the best of our ability as like big tech engineers to make sure that customers have the most control and context and decision making that we can afford them, but also that like when we have to comply with government requirements, provided that the government respects and there's like an established agreed definition that they respect the rule of law, we're going to answer their request to the most specific degree of our ability.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Eugenia Löhtori, Lawfare's fellow in technology policy and law, with senior privacy engineer at Netflix and former Army's Reserve Intelligence Officer, Lukas Bundonis.
Like when the news says it's a tough time out there for data protection, it is. Partially because of machine learning, partially because of like a vague slide towards populism and authoritarianism in many parts of the world. It doesn't mean we should stop trying.
Today, we're talking about the relationship between law enforcement and tech companies, what that relationship looks like in the US and other countries, and the different ways in which that communication can be politicized. So, Lukas, you sit in a very interesting intersection of law and engineering and technology. So can you maybe start by just describing what it is you do and what your day-to-day looks like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eugenia. My day-to-day is mostly about being a bridge between engineers, whether they're data or software engineers, and lawyers and other legal professionals. Most of the nexus of like data portability and law enforcement response is answering requirements from legal about what to add to subject access requests or how to manage requests from customers or law enforcement about data. And it's been that way ever since I joined the field about 4 years ago.
So tell us a little bit how you joined the field. You know, what were the skills that allowed you to do this work? Because you're not a lawyer, right?
I'm also not an engineer either. So,
also not an engineer.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it happened by accident. A lot of careers start by happy accident. I had some intelligence experience from the military. I had a policy background from school and writing some papers for academia and for research outfits. And I took a lot of classes that focused on, first, cybersecurity, because I was really interested in cybersecurity policy. And then I started getting interested in emerging tech, and kind of like that lent itself pretty well to first working in privacy engineering. And honestly, like I spun some experience working in storage systems into like a project that focused on law enforcement response at Google. And that project ended up being my segue into helping their law enforcement response teams just sort of improve the ability and kind of like protections inherent in their products to keep customers safe while answering requirements from government and law enforcement. So it was very, very happy accident, and something that I think that lends itself well to like my mix of skills, non-skills, whatever you would call happens to be in that bucket.
I feel like that's usually how it happens, happy accidents and being able to seize opportunities when they come your way, at least for us who are maybe, I wouldn't say early in the field, but when I started, and I think when you started, there wasn't a path to do this work. You just kind of learned how to do it.
Yeah, not at all. Like, I mean, some of it's like, especially because some of these technologies are like emerging or they're attached to something that like governments have trouble understanding. And then you get into this weird territory where even the companies that make this technology don't really understand it super well. So it's like there's nobody that really knows how to grapple with. I mean, maybe some of the engineers developing the tech, whether it's machine learning or something else, know like how to innovate in the field, but they're not really sure how to add protections for it because it hasn't been invented yet. And that's true of cybersecurity, that's true of ML, that's true of a lot of different disciplines.
Yeah. And then crucially, this bridge function that you're describing, that you described kind of from the get-go, where you may understand the technology, but you may not understand what the legal regime around it is.
Oh, absolutely. It's up to like first-line engineers and legal professionals to be able to make informed decisions about risk, ownership, acceptance, and kind of forecasting, because they either build the tech or they know the law. A lot of times you'll hear privacy engineers specifically talk about knowing a little bit about each of those categories, but not being sort of like the first line expert in like any specific one of them. We are necessarily privacy experts, but it's challenging to even define privacy in the context of emerging technology. It's really challenging, actually.
So one of the reasons why I was excited about our conversation is I think you bring such an interesting perspective to this. At least for me, when I think and when I talk to people about the relationship between tech companies and law enforcement, I tend to hear it more from the law enforcement side or from researchers who are looking at this and studying this from the outside. But, maybe it's a little bit less common to hear from someone who's actually inside the big tech companies. At least that's been the case for me. So can you characterize that relationship between law enforcement and the companies from that unique perspective that you bring?
Absolutely. So with it in mind that it's like a small field and, there are definitely sort of better spokespeople for like legal and risk positions. Like from an engineering standpoint, you always want a system to do what it's supposed to do. Like if you build it and then it has a certain failover tolerance and like you generally try to do your best to provide the best product. And if that product happens to have, as is required by not just GDPR, but now CCPA and a bunch of laws that are coming out across the planet, as well as the US, you have to have some measure of data portability baked into every product. Like customers now expect to have some type of granular control over what data is available to them. The tension arises when there's also sort of like this access question or this access expectation among law enforcement and governments. I mean, I have seen dozens upon dozens of headlines that revolve around different countries' level of expectation that they have an access to consumer data via a tech company. It's something that I understand some folks at Lawfare are very interested in, some stuff that I'm interested in terms of these tech companies acting as functional intermediaries for this surveillance. It's not that we conduct it ourselves, though there's lots of different positions floating around the government now as to whether or not there's explicit surveillance being conducted by companies. It's more along the lines of, we build our products to the best of our ability as like big tech engineers to make sure that customers have the most control and context and decision making that we can afford them, the ability to delete data, all those different things that are baked into GDPR, but also that like when we have to comply with government requirements, provided that the government respects and there's like an established agreed definition that they respect the rule of law, we're going to answer their requests to the most specific degree of our ability. There are some constraints on that ability, like lack of specificity. So if a bit of legal process comes in and it's not specific enough to target an account, or maybe it's for data that we don't have, there are occasions that any sane tech company would outright reject the request or push back and say you need to be more specific. If the country or government does not reflect what we would consider the rule of law. And that's generally a consensus position that isn't really spoken for among any specific tech company, but you'll see a common pattern where like one company will trumpet their response above another, but they're all functionally doing the same thing. They're making it so that there is a precedent established. And it's not a formal legal precedent. No one's actually writing new law on this. No one's writing papers. I mean, some people are writing papers. Hopefully soon myself to be included in that company. But generally, like, that's fascinating to me because it's still in the spirit of honoring multiple different users of that ecosystem, making sure these requests that they reflect like only the degree of accuracy that they provide, that the requests don't result in a legal data production that's over or under the mark, and that it reflects like legal reality and like the reality of the product, like availability of data, things like that. It's a world that most people don't like. They like you said, they do know it exists from the perspective of law enforcement wants to unlock a phone. Or like even then, they do it on the basis of encryption, and it becomes an encryption debate, and there's some kind of, I wouldn't call it silly, but I would call it like very ham-fisted debate between whether or not encryption should exist in the first place. This is a little bit different and sometimes more nuanced.
So I'm hoping to get to this later, but since you kind of brought it up, I feel like I need to ask it now. You know, of course, this is not just about responding to requests from US agencies or US law enforcement.
Nope.
This is spanning all over the world because, big tech companies have operations everywhere. And, I would love to hear a little bit more about what it's like to answer to these different regimes. What are the different things that you need to keep in mind? But also, I was just reminded of the recent testimony to Congress that we saw from Microsoft. And they stated, for example, that when there are requests from the Chinese government, because that hearing focused a lot on China and Microsoft's presence there, they said, they maybe just don't respond to those requests. Is that, typical? I know that there's concern around the access of foreign governments to Americans' data.
It's very typical. So you'll see an industry standard where a lot of major tech companies either don't have business operations in China, and each company has their own reasons for not doing that. But when requests come in from, say, China or Russia, typically, and for different reasons, they will just not align to the request. I think maybe in the early thousands or early 2010s, there was a bit of a gray area where a couple of the names in big tech were trying to do like a hybrid business model or do comply with CCP censorship, but most folks have gotten out for kind of the same reasons. It's one of the weird ways in which they're all very harmonious. They don't like to answer requests from governments that they strongly believe would misuse the data to target dissidents and stuff like that.
So what about other, governments? What's the range of how comfortable between, yes, we will likely reply to this within the margins of the law, to we're just not going to have operations in your territory?
Well, it can be, some of the risks that come, without mentioning any specific countries, some of the risks that get considered have been things like degree of fraud and corruption in submitting these requests. How easy is it to submit fake requests, regardless of the subject matter or the type of request? So that's a big consideration. It's not always a logistic consideration whether, a given group or geographic region of policing is willing to use the tools that you provide them, or how corrupt a given court system is. But that's all pretty kind of wrapped up into the overall picture. And then sometimes it's who gets elected into leadership and how do they use the information that they glean from tech companies. And there are a couple of standouts in the last 10 to 15 years that would fit that bill, whether it's in Europe or in Asia. But generally, there's no one-size-fits-all way to decide that a country you used to honor requests from no longer follows the rule of law. It's tricky, because then a lot of companies will have to contend with their business in that country, too. Do they want to catch smoke from a government that, may toe the line, but they toe the line successfully? It's really challenging. As opposed to governments that are a joy to work with, that have really robust regulatory agencies that flag instances of overproduction. Again, without sort of getting into specifics, it's just it's a big scale. To say what is the scale? It's very wide.
It's every single country. It's
every single country that's not Russia, China, and a handful of others. Yeah.
Yeah. So an interesting trend is this, requirement in legislation that you as a company must have an office and personnel present in the country where you're operating, right? And there's been a lot of concerns that can lead to applying pressure, right? Because it's easier to say, well, we're not going to respond to your request if everyone that works for you is in another country, it's far away, there isn't really much that they can do. But not only you need to have a presence, but it is considered an offense maybe to not respond to the government requests. There's leverage there for the government. Do you think that's going to affect how we're seeing operations being maintained or not?
I hate to give the cop-out answer, but again, it depends on the country and it depends on the company. I have sort of personal anecdotal experience that unfortunately I can't share, that generally there are creative ways to still base your office and still do things with your people and your data to be able to protect them successfully. And that is, again, something that is surprisingly common across big tech companies. If the risk gets too great, so if not just lawyers, but your security staff or your campus staff say like, hey, there is an imminent risk to people in this country, or like the person that just got into office is like not going to honor their word to keep the campus safe, that is an easy like contact the State Department type get them out situation. But beyond that, the safest thing is to withdraw. The medium ground is to just be able to apply a little bit of reverse pressure, because like most of these companies, whatever the company is so valuable to have in that country that like I can't think of even cases where like certain companies still do business in Russia, or they do business in like a country that's like towing the line on authoritarianism. It can sometimes be a weird bluff that like because they need the company to provide those services. They're like really valuable for the economy, or like people can get jobs doing that work. So the companies have more leverage than it seems like they do.
Since we're speaking about the international part of this, the UN is in the process of negotiating a new cybercrime convention. And it has been criticized, me amongst the people who have criticized it, for, between other things, its very broad scope and, honestly, the insufficient protections that it provides to human rights. But the convention would also create, some new obligations and create some challenges for tech companies. So could you maybe speak a little bit about what these changes would be and how worried you are about them?
So I am not like super well read on the current state of negotiations. So if there's like later context that you can provide that I miss, like please feel free. But generally, one of the most interesting things that I saw in the considerations for like the treaty negotiations was this concept of traffic data, because it was like listed by like the ICO and some of the language in the draft sessions as like core to cybercrime investigations, to be able to share data between stuff. There's another act that like is like that, like in electronic evidence. Like there's a lot of like talk in the EU, at least specifically, rather than the UN, to like be able to share stuff across, like share evidence for terrorist investigations and intelligence investigations. But this idea that somehow ambient traffic data, which to me just sounds like communications metadata. We've been talking about that in the States for like 30 years, longer actually, is really fascinating. Because a lot of times, I don't know that, like, having every actor that is responsible for each endpoint of, like, a major breach, having access to the same, like, telemetry and investigations data is actually going to speed up the investigation. Like, normally there's, like, a couple of key actors, or there's, like, one person that pushed a bad update or something like that, that, like, does most of the lifting. And it's necessarily because they have access to that telemetry. Like, is giving it to a bunch of different government agencies going to help? Does that mean I'm a critique of the treaty negotiations? Not really. I just think that it's like, that concept of traffic data is really fuzzy, and I thought that was interesting. To answer your question directly, like, do I believe that would have, like, meaningful changes for the way that tech companies do things for, like, cybersecurity investigations? I think one of the biggest tensions I see is that tech companies still have a really fraught relationship sharing, like, information about a vulnerability with the government. Because it's loosely assumed that, like, the government, whether it's any government in the world, as you, like, are very well aware from your own expertise, like, they just don't trust that they're not actively using them. That they're not actively, like, using something to, like, that's later going to get patched. So the way that ties in with traffic data to me is it's just, I'm glad that the UN is thinking about it and some of the drafters are thinking about it, but I don't know that it's going to compel companies to rethink the way they collect that telemetry or share it, for that matter. Unless there's something about the negotiations that I'm missing. Like, please take it away and tell me something else that you found interesting about the same topic, because I'm happy to respond.
No, I think that's interesting. The part that I focused more on is the fact that there aren't sufficient protections in place, and that the scope is just way too broad, honestly. Literally everything would become a cybercrime, and I think that that's dangerous. But, that always poses interesting challenges for everyone who actually needs to operationalize a treaty. But I want to bring us back to the US. It's been an interesting year for privacy and surveillance. There's some recent reporting that Schumer is expecting the child online safety bills to clear the chamber soon. So that, again, going back to the theme of how is this going to change your job and how big tech companies operate, do you see these bills creating significant change to your day-to-day or not?
Child safety is tricky, and while sort of like acknowledging that the law enforcement response world necessarily touches child safety, like in like a sort of like a meaningful like relationship, it's challenging because a lot of like the requirements for like international agreements for domestic law enforcement are pretty ironclad for like how you treat with that subject and like different like, issues that crop up on the internet. I don't know that it would so much change my job just because where I know work has less data than Google. I think overall, the landscape may get tricky in countries just like the cybercrime negotiations that use like broad collection apparatuses to like go after crimes in a really weirdly fungible way. Like, to say like, hey, I'm writing this bill or I'm going to send this legal process from government X to company Y to target a crime that involves like putting children at risk, or I'm going to do it because it's a cybercrime. To me, that's a really like broad continuum that has similarities in the sense that they just use very broad government vehicles to target the same thing. In the US, I don't necessarily see that happening, but sometimes child safety bills do include like weird provisions.
Let's talk about something that is, I think, maybe a little bit more squarely in your realm, which is the renewal of FISA 702. I'm sure you follow that closely. So I would like to hear just your thoughts on that entire process. How did you experience all of that?
Yeah, I watched a couple of the debates, and I read the commentary, not just here on Lawfare, but elsewhere on the internet. I talked about it with my coworkers. I talked about it with some legal folks. And generally, like, 702 renewal always seems pretty cut and dried. Like, it's sort of a necessary element of how the Bureau targets suspects in intelligence investigations and law enforcement investigations. The challenge becomes, it seems like I'm a broken record at this point, but when people add, like, weird provisions to the renewal. So the iteration that I saw was, like, the Renewing Intelligence and Securing America Act that folks from different civil liberties groups argued in some commentary that, like, it would sort of, like, give a broader, ability of federal law enforcement to compel companies to be able to surrender data, or, like, that there's, like, some type of, like, more pressure under the current renewal that they can apply. The weird part about the pressure that law enforcement applies to companies is, like, they can, like, send a bunch of requests, or they can send national security letters, they can send actual, like, legal process that compels companies to, like, set up, broader and broader legal productions. I couldn't, even after reading the text of the bill, find stuff that, like, expanded that requirement very meaningfully. I think the challenge is going to become when that involves, like, the most interesting wrinkle doesn't actually come from domestic surveillance for me. Because for, like, U.S. persons, which 702 provides that the intelligence community can't target any U.S. persons, including if it's, like, targeting a foreign person for the purposes of targeting a domestic person. The challenge comes when, like, those people are abroad, or, like, there are other weird entanglements with, like, cross-border data sharing, and, like, folks have, like, other meaningful relationships with, like, other data repositories and other regulations in different countries. Like, I think that's where the compulsion, or sort of the compulsion becomes stronger, a lot of the protections break down, and that's my biggest concern with, like, changes to FISA that have gone forward through the renewal. I don't like what you would call, like, backdoor inclusions. They're not great. And coming from the intelligence community myself, I respect the need and the sort of, the need for constancy and like a degree of specificity, a degree of aggressiveness in every intelligence collection law. But the relationship that intelligence law has with companies, let's say it's fraught. I don't like the landscape, especially as I mentioned before, when it gets into like silly debates about encryption and stuff like that. I hesitate to sort of like say that like that's a good trend for the future.
It's interesting. Not that long ago, not to self-plug, but I will do it regardless. I had this really great conversation with Joseph Cox, who wrote the book The Dark Wire, about the FBI kind of building out their own hardened cell phone company so that they could sell that to drug dealers, and they just managed the entire company, and that's how they had access to the communication. And like, while you cannot expect that type of operation all the time, it just seems like maybe a better approach than requiring all these companies to break or weaken their encryption just to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually had a couple recent conversations with like former law enforcement professionals, and I think the general argument is based on a difference in mission rather than like technology. Where, like, they wake up basically every morning thinking, like, how can they not only, like, drive up a statistic like prosecution rate or, like, conviction rate or amount of putting dangerous people in jail, but, like, how to break up networks, how to break up gangs, how to break up terrorists. And generally, if they can do it while meaningfully going above and beyond the requirements of the law, they are doing a good job. But that is a corollary to their primary mission, which is just, like, keeping people safe. And I've met tons of people who really do believe in this mission and do a good job at it. Encryption always seems to be this thing that when I talk about it with them, it's like, well, like, of course people deserve privacy, but I'm trying to catch terrorists. And that's it. That's like the end of the discussion most of the time. For encryption advocates, as I'm sure many of the folks that you've already spoken to and like written about, like, it's the exact opposite. It's like the main goal for driving protections in the end-to-end encryption space is just that the people who use Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, Wicker, whatever, are, they're dissidents, they're marginalized groups. Sure, we're willing to admit that, like, military and, like, spies use these too, but, like, also, like, most of these groups are protected and they can't, like, if they have that encryption weakened or broken in any significant way, they will be rendered just as vulnerable as the terrorists or the criminals would be to the FBI. And it's an unacceptable trade-off that you're willing to make here. With regards to, like, the subject of, like, dark wire or, like, that whole managed company, I think the American government has a long history of creating, like, little legally sound, like, legal snares to catch people and, like, subvert the definition of entrapment to be able to break people up and get their comms broken down. I think the value of still asking companies for permission is because the companies can serve, however strong or weak that could be at any given point, a meaningful intermediary check on government surveillance. Going direct to the customer still feels a little... Yeah, I know I'm not a lawyer. It's legally not entrapment, but it does feel like it's sort of abrogating the process through which you're able to conduct surveillance fair and square. I think the simple definition of surveillance is literally like observing someone for the purpose of collecting evidence. And how do you know that what you're collecting is going to go into evidence? Like, how do you even submit the process for, like, a warrant if you're just snarfing up all their comms? Like, there's no evidentiary basis for the collection. I mean, even in intelligence, I mean, there's lots of hair-raising stories and, vague or explicit human rights violations in the history of the global intelligence services. But at the same time, there's a basis for there's supposed to be a basis for every interrogation, for every collection, for every like thing that you submit to your agency head, to your lead, to your commander in order to be able to gather that intelligence. So that's why those plans, those like company things, like they always sort of like I said, I'm sure they're airtight, but as a newly minted privacy person going on 5 years, that stuff just gives me the heaves.
I'm failing right now to remember which proposed legislation this was, but not that long ago, there was a piece of legislation being proposed about encryption that basically said, we want you to have a way to access that is proven to not weaken general protections, right? So basically give access, but make it still be good. And it just seems like such an interesting example of that disconnect or the lack of a bridge between policymakers and actual technologists, because sometimes like that technology doesn't exist. Like there isn't a way to do that, if I understand it correctly. So like how do you even get around that if there are requirements that just you cannot meet in the law?
I mean, I hate to be like tchotchke or precious with this comment, but like just make them work harder. Like if you can, it's proven that like the National Security Agency can study Tor endpoints and then find out the computers that the traffic was on by looking at the endpoints. I mean, theoretically, you could do that with endpoint devices. You could do it with computers, you could do it with phones. Does it always work? No. Is it always in time to stop terrorists? No. But that's sort of the imperfect solution that meaningfully comports with the burden placed on intelligence and law enforcement agencies and cops. Like, anywhere up and down the chain, encryption exists for a reason. Cops earn their salary and they do a great job catching bad guys when they find workarounds that keep people who want to use encrypted chats safe. Like, that's kind of like a weird, people do take sides on that, very pointed sides, and somebody can listen to this and think, well, this guy's like ludicrous because it's only one or the other. But I really do think that making both sides of the community work harder at sort of what they do, has a benefit for everyone. Unfortunately, there's also like a benefit for criminals and terrorists if you just like keep strong encryption. But it's not to the extent that like they still can't be caught.
So something that I've been quite interested in, especially looking at some of the recent developments over the last year, is how politicized communication between government agencies and tech companies has become. And I think we see that most clearly with social media companies, because the communication between, DOJ, FBI, and tech companies about misinformation efforts or how to maintain election security has been criticized very publicly. There's a new report the DOJ Inspector General released evaluating the efforts to coordinate information sharing about foreign malign influence threats to U.S. elections. And the kind of three big findings were there's a lack of policy on how you do this. There are First Amendment implications, and there's also a lack of strategy guiding the interactions. I know your field is not necessarily social media, but you do a lot of the relationship between the tech company that you work for and law enforcement. So do you think these concerns translate at all to your field? Have you seen any kind of backlash about the way that the two sides work together, or has it been kind of its own little pocket that is just not touched?
I think they're very related. I hate to be disappointing when I say, like, from whichever topic, like, doesn't specifically affect, like, law enforcement response, because folks in government and cops will always need data for investigations. They're always going to want to know about something. I think the dichotomy I'd like to briefly examine is, like, it's assumed that Democrats will go after tech companies. Like, it's just like they will hold them accountable because, they're harming consumers, or like an open society requires snarled companies and they don't pay enough taxes and they're building a bunch of evil machine learning. And then Republicans will not touch them. And I think that is false. I think it just, and like, even if like you agree on its face that like you would agree with me that that's false, a lot of people, like, if Republicans win in November, they generally will go after tech companies that they don't like or that didn't give them money. They're a little more personal these days. Democrats don't always go after tech companies successfully, nor do they go after them evenly. So it's always like, and even depending upon how, different cases in regulatory agencies proceed, it's one of those things where, like, it's never quite so cut and dried. I think in the general pullback of government from tech with, like, social media and just that relationship, I do think it's important to look at how, like, search companies don't derank conservatives because they post conservative stuff. It's because it's generally associated with misinformation, like a 10 to 40% degree of reliability, depending upon the site. I just made that up. That's not a real statistic. But generally, like, overall, the biggest thing that concerns me about that pullback is a lack of, like, keeping relationships strong. So whether it's in something that you know very well, like cybersecurity, or something that I used to work in, like machine learning, that lack of understanding is going to produce for really silly and ineffective regulation. Like, if they don't know how the products are made, they don't know what they're capable of. I was a big fan of reading the non-binding Bill of Rights that the White House put out recently. But, like, generally, like, it doesn't have any teeth if the pace of innovation is going to outstrip it in, like, a year or two or less, knowing machine learning these days. So whether it's social media, cybersecurity, or machine learning, I think that pullback doesn't have as much implication for my, small subfield, or for, like, the extent to which the American government is going to be willing to regulate its big tech companies, but just that, like, that it won't be able to effectively. I really do worry about that breakdown in relationship. Let alone, like, if you wanted to have some type of meaningful relationship for defense or for gov tech, like, all of that, like, interstitia matters. It shouldn't be overly cozy. I mean, I think any sort of, like, free-thinking American citizen should be concerned if it gets too cozy, because that also produces bad regulation. So you have to have something in the middle, I think.
I want to pull from two threats that you presented in that answer. The first one, you hinted at the differences between Democrats and Republicans and their relationship with big tech. This is an election year. We just saw the change, Biden stepping down, Kamala Harris taking over as the Democratic nominee. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about what it looks like if either Trump or Harris actually wins. What can we expect to be different or remain the same?
I expect sort of like to re-pull on the part of it that I introduced. There is a big expectation that if a Democrat wins, the tech companies are in trouble type of they're not going to be able to do anything type of a thing. I don't know, at least right now, whether or not we have a chance of seeing, like, toothy, strong, and sensible legislation from Congress on either privacy or machine learning that is national, even if Kamala Harris does win. Because the companies are in the driver's seat. Like, I don't know how to emphasize that with an exclamation point enough, but there are definitely sort of admirable efforts, whether it's from, like, regulatory bodies or, like, NIST or anything like that. Like, it's good faith effort, and there are lots of cool policies being kicked around in DC that are meaningful, that include data privacy as, like, one of its precepts, and I love that, right? But the top 4 or 5 AI companies have already scraped the entire, whatever it is. Like, they're going to run out of data in 10 years or something like that. So I don't know how you sort of meaningfully eat at that advantage, especially since there are other things that a Democratic administration would have to contend with, whether it's immigration, security, like 2+ active, really big war zones, and, like, buckets of human rights issues, like all kinds of, like, things that, like, just will pull away from the fact that it seems like they want to craft a narrative that they're not pulling away from the world, they're rejecting Republican isolationism, and now it's now you're supposed to regulate really fast, really powerful, really wealthy machine learning companies and also protect user privacy and fight the encryption fight the way the Democrats should. That seems like a bad quagmire, to be honest. I think they're going to have to pick. And if they do win, I wish them luck. For Republicans, it's also kind of equally interesting. I mentioned that some of the sort of rejection of like tech regulation or going after specific tech companies is like personal to whether they're being deranked. It's more nuanced than that. I think that Republicans overall are mostly sort of like they're pretty famous for engaging meaningfully in culture wars or like having like certain companies now be conservatively aligned, like to mention like some of the recent backers that it came out to give money to the Trump campaign. They are no less jazzed about AI. I mean, like I frame it as like Democrats don't want they're going to regulate machine learning. It's like both political parties love that stuff. Like they love sort of the dynamics of like, I think that conventionally Democrats have done a better job of sort of like safeguarding the worker. Like generally, like many Democrats are pro-union or they're sort of like after worker protections and privacy protections. I think for Republicans, you'll see a lot of like fights that revolve around the culture war, whether it's like search ranking or AI in art and AI in UGC, AI on social media, data privacy for all of those same things, but data privacy in a way that's sort of like, it's a weird cross-section where like they care a lot about data privacy if somebody is like, sort of called out for posting a bunch, like nobody wants to get like canceled for like posting stuff on social media about like, gun rights or being part of like a conservative right-wing site. So they do care about privacy. It's like, it's a very like, it's a complicated thing to explain. I think generally, though, they are very happy to bring the fight like kind of home. I mean, they are full tilt en route. Like Trump and Vance are en route to like, take the country back 200 years to Andrew Jackson. Like they want to focus on domestic issues, and they're like, I think naturally tech regulation, billionaires that support them, culture war stuff, gun rights and immigration, misinformation on social media. I think that whether it's like meaningfully different for me as an employee in this space, I couldn't tell you. I can't predict that. I just know that they're very comfortable bringing things domestic. And that's kind of what I see for them.
And the final thread that you've mentioned several times is machine learning, artificial intelligence. I don't think we can go through a tech podcast nowadays without talking about it. We saw that Meta had to halt the use of AI in Brazil because of the Data Protection Authority ban. Do you think there is a trend towards preventing artificial intelligence deployment or not? What's going to happen with all of that? How do you see it from where you sit?
I admire when a government believes they can or sort of like it reminds me of like the European withdrawal of some of the key, sort of like the major powerful features of the models due to like protection requirements. Nothing is stopping this train. The people, the processes, the tech, the companies that like I've engaged with, I would say being like a loose adherent and follower of the ML community for like 2.5 years now. Because I honestly, when we were at Fletcher, like I read about it and like I was covering it, got excited, I wrote a little paper about it, but like there is this headlong fascination with birthing like super intelligence. Like there are adherents all throughout Silicon Valley. There are billionaires, there are politicians that just want to see this thing rocket. And like I don't know why. Like it's like they've never seen The Matrix or they've never seen a movie about this stuff, but they will strip away the capacity of most modern governments to contend with how powerful that crap is, just by continuing to scrape data, generating synthetic data to replace, signing deals with publishers and stuff like that. I really do appreciate, I'm painting a little bit of an apocalyptic picture. I think that, overall, it's really good when governments, whether it's Brazil, the US, and Europe, try to meaningfully snarl what I would consider just like crappy and really like mildly to moderately disrespectful AI practices in its development, because it's good. Like that's how you tease apart a good baseline and restrictions for regulation. Not too dissimilar from cybersecurity, maybe just a little bit more juice, a little more powerful. That being said, it's not going to change my job, because if anything, more ML means more data and more data types. So that's all I'll say about that. Also, like, it's not going to change that headlong fascination. Like, it's how to really describe it. Like, people, like, God, they just cannot, like, get enough of this concept that, like, even the frickin' safety people, like, even the people that work in safety and protection, they're getting fired. They're getting fired or removed because they're getting concerned about data, normal things, like data training practices, let alone whether something scary like this is sentient. So I don't think it's going to stop anything. I think it's going to keep going. It's going to be up to like data protection professionals like us to give a crap about putting in the guardrails, because otherwise the development's going to continue unimpeded. If it were to stop deployment, like if you were to stop deployment in one country or stop deployment of a feature, it would just go unimpeded in another. And that's how it's going to keep going.
Lukas, if there's anything, any last thoughts that you want to leave us with, or something that you wish we'd covered but we didn't, you have the floor.
Yeah. So I tend to be like a rambler and kind of pessimistic about most tech, despite the fact that it is my livelihood. Generally, I think that whether it's law enforcement response, data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, or machine learning, I'd like to say that there are a lot of like core, really good professionals of like various degrees of like investment in the hype cycle that like are doing a damn good job every day, like making sure that users are protected in like the best way that they are currently able to make them. A lot of decisions about like frontline protections, again, whether it's any of the fields that we've discussed on this episode, is just like we all apply pressure. We have a responsibility to apply pressure as data protection professionals. You can call it data protection, whatever the bucket is that you'd want to group all this stuff into. And I think that it's just like when the news says it's a tough time out there for data protection, it is. Partially because of machine learning, partially because of like a vague slide towards populism and authoritarianism in many parts of the world. It doesn't mean we should stop trying. I think it's super important to encourage data protection folks to just keep their heads up and like not submit to the pessimism and some of the rancor that some of these trends produce in the industry, because it's important to do our jobs.
Okay, that is actually a cheerier note to end with. So, Lukas, thank you so much for joining me. This was a great conversation.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osvand of Go Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.